Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is John. If you have watched me over the past 3 or 4 months, you knew that when I made my Historathon video for the spring, one of the things I wanted to do, well, my only really big plan for the spring actually, was to read about the Vikings, at least at that time. And I managed to read 2 books about the Vikings. That was where my project basically ended, and got distracted by other things, as I tend to be. But I read, like I said, 2 books, and I want to talk about those 2 one at a time, as always. And the first one I want to talk about is this one, Children of Ash and Elm, A History of the Vikings by Neil Price. And you see there, it's from Basic Books. I got this off of Hamilton Books 1 or 2 years ago. I think in last year, in preparation for reading it for this year, because I didn't have enough Viking stuff. Neil Price is an academic archaeologist who has been at the University of Uppsala for a long time, over 20 years. And in The Children of Ash and Elm, he tries to get inside the mind of Vikings and take them on their own terms, instead of the terms of people who came after them and almost always wrote for them or wrote down their myths in their place. Because the Vikings never really had a chance to tell their own story. They were, outside of runes, pretty much people that didn't write anything. So any history, any myths that we have of the Vikings were not really written by Vikings as we know and think of them. And he really wants to maybe dispel anything like culturally predominant images of Vikings as only violent pillagers, even though they did that, and raiders, although they clearly did that too, in the minds of his readers. Price organizes the book in a topical way. I'll show you the table of contents here. So I don't know if you can see that, but I'll read them out. The Home of Their Shapes, which is a discussion of sort of Viking cosmology, I would say, their myth. Social Network, Border Crossings, The Performance of Power, Meeting the Others, about traveling to other lands and expansion, Dealing with the Dead, stuff like that. So chapter titles that pretty clearly illustrate to the reader what the content in the chapter is going to be about. And the chapters take up a lot of different topics that you might expect to find in a 1-volume treatment of Viking history, including the rise of the Vikings a few centuries after the Great Migration. The Great Migration being that series of movements all throughout Europe right after the fall of the Roman Empire, where people no longer had the governmental infrastructure or power hierarchies that they used to live their everyday lives. So they traveled in search of more stability, food, shelter, resources, etc. The invasions, raids, settlement patterns, the rise of pirate kings, and trading networks, which clearly had an influence on the formation of the earliest known Scandinavian kingdoms. He ends with their gradual expansion over much of what was then the known world, from Vinland, kind of an indefinite location off the eastern coast of Canada, all the way to the Kievan Rus, and even the Byzantine Empire, where they served in important military roles in the Byzantine military. There is a push between academic archaeologists or academics who study the Vikings to when they write about Viking history? Should they prioritize literary sources, the sagas, the Eddas, the mythology, etc.? Or should they prioritize material culture, the archaeology they find? The historians that rely more on archaeology write books, it seems, that can be a little drier because they're cautious to make claims, while authors who draw from more literary sources and traditions emphasize the telling of an interesting history, even if they may make some poetic or take some historical license in doing so. So this question of archaeology or literature is even more important when we stop to realize two things. Like I said, all of the written records that we have of the Vikings are by people who have long since abandoned Norse paganism, the religion of the Vikings, and sometimes even have a clearly vested interest in portraying that paganism in a negative light, like Christians of the time, who had since been converted to Christianity. And while Vikings had writing, like I said, they had runes. Runes were used for very narrow sets of purposes, like religious purposes, magic, sacrifices, things like that. There are almost no examples of prosaic things like lists or business transactions or navigational directions about how to get from one place to another, like Denmark to the Faroe Islands. That was all oral. It was all passed down orally. So writing the perfect Viking book will have to grapple with finding this kind of ideal balance between these two approaches, the literary, mythological one and the archaeological one. Children of Ash and Elm leans more into the archaeology, I would say, as one might expect of Neil Price, who is an archaeologist, as I said at the top of the review, which may make it a little bit more of a drier reading experience for those who have maybe a limited interest in archaeology. But it nevertheless serves as a solid introduction to a broad range of topics surrounding Viking history. If you prefer a book with more of a flair for storytelling that relies on vivid vignettes instead of sort of the more cautious, scholarly steps Price takes, I would recommend another book, which I will post directly after this review. And this book is by Anders Winroth, and this is The Age of Vikings, that is put out by Princeton University. This is a bit more of has, like I said, some narrative flair, narrative storytelling, novelistic sort of storytelling, whereas Children of Ash and Elm is interesting, but a bit on maybe the drier side. And if you're interested in that book, that's the review that's going to be posted directly after this one. So there's still a lot of really interesting stuff in here, certainly still worthwhile to read. But I wanted to share two little bits that I pulled. One more historical, one more archaeological. I'll start out with the archaeological one. That just sort of shines a light on how interesting the Vikings can be. And this one is a little gross, but I'll still share it. Quote, this is a long quote from the book. Quote, "The consumption of food and drink was in due course followed by other needs, except perhaps in Valhall. In the countryside, nature provided its own open-air lavatories, but on settlements, latrines were usually dug as deep pits in the vicinity of the dwelling structures. In urban settings, they were in the backyards. Often lined with wicker wood for stability, they sometimes had a stick, or the grand option, even a holed plank over the top to sit on. When almost full, the pits were simply filled in and sealed, and a new one was dug nearby. They were among the most unpleasant elements of early medieval life to excavate, especially if the ground is waterlogged. thus preserving everything inside the latrines in pristine condition, still moist with its original bouquet. Uh, just the just the olfactory impression there. It's just perfect. I once spent, extending the quote here, I once spent a nasty week trying to hold my breath while digging to the base of one in York, in England. Inside are the clumps of moss used as toilet paper, the scraps of cloth that were the Viking equivalent of sanitary towels, and occasionally all manner of other objects that people had dropped while otherwise engaged, but sensibly decided not to retrieve. That's from Chapter 3, The Social Network. And next, an astounding statistic, I thought, about the amount of Danegeld the Franks had to fork over to the Vikings to keep them out of their country and stop them from pillaging and raiding their cities. Danegeld, if you're unfamiliar, is were a series of payments that the people around the Vikings gave to the Vikings to basically just say, okay, we give up. Will you go away if we give you some money? And these were extortionate amounts of money. I mean, just tremendously huge amounts of money. But they were so successful at what they did, raiding, pillaging, stealing, that people would do anything to keep them away, even paying them off. And that's what Danegeld is. So here's another extended quote, and then I'll sort of wrap up the review there. Quote, "This Frankish coda to the century of the great raids also provides a moment to review their real cost and to try to understand their true scale from a different perspective. The damage to the imperial economy," he's talking about the Frankish economy here, "was without parallel. If the data from the continental written sources is combined, the protection money paid to the Vikings, Danegeld, during the 5th century totaled about 30,000 pounds weight of silver, most of it in cash, a vast sum equivalent to 7 million silver pennies over a period when the estimated total output of the Frankish mints was in the region of maybe 50 million coins. This equates to approximately 17% of the entire monetary output of the Frankish economy. $1 in $7 that the Frankish economy was responsible for went to Danegeld, to paying off the Vikings so they just wouldn't attack them anymore. And this was for a century. Evaporated in the payment of extortion demands that produced no tangible positive gain, and in many cases failed to appease the Vikings anyway, because sometimes they would take the Danegeld and just attack you again. Because, hey, you're a Viking, right? You can do whatever the hell you want. But a really interesting book. I hope I didn't put anyone too far off of it by saying it was a little bit on the drier side, but that's only in a comparative way to the next book I'm going to talk about. This is A Children of Ash and Elm, a History of the Vikings by Neil Price. My first Viking book, which I really enjoyed. Thought it was solid. Wouldn't call it a thrilling read, Wall Street Journal, but still a very good one. I will leave it here, and I will talk to everyone soon. Bye.